Welcome to Successful Partnerships for Successful Projects, a National Watershed Coalition webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is built on the premise that the local watershed project sponsors who have 100% of the resources necessary to successfully engage the USDA watershed program are the exception rather than the rule. And then in most cases, some sort of partnership is required to assemble sufficient funding, create leverage, and secure the skill sets required to implement a project. Our presenters have a great track record of success and real-world experience that they're going to be sharing with us today, as well as advice to offer. And the notion that projects with multiple partners might be new to some, and for those that are already utilizing partnering concept, the webinar should provide information that would streamline and improve the process. So buckle up, get a piece of paper handy, get something to write with handy, and then begin to write down those things that you're going to be utilizing in your watershed or your project into the future. Our presenters, just to let you know who they are right now and more about them in just a bit: Julie Davies-O'Shea, the Executive Director of the Farmers Conservation Alliance in Hood River, Oregon. And also she's joined by Chuck Thomas, our Executive Engineer, Southern Sandoval County Arroyo Flood Control Authority, and Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Now, a little bit about logistics. The voice you're listening to right now is Ray Ledgerwood, the moderator from BoardWorks by Ledgerwood. In just a bit, you'll be hearing from Dan and Lisa. Dan Siebert and Lisa Knopf-Owen are National Watershed Coalition Chair and Executive Director. The webinar ID is posted there. If you're just joining us by phone, you're going to get the most out of this if you do join us via the computer. The webinar ID 766-285-939. Join on the web at www.joingotowebinar.com. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Siebert and Lisa Knopf-Owen, our Executive Director and Chair of the National Watershed Coalition. Dan and Lisa.
Good morning, Ray. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Dan.
I'll let you go first, welcoming folks to the webinar.
Okay, thank you. Just that, we would like to welcome the 103 of you that I see are connected to the webinar this morning, and we appreciate your time and attendance. This is the third in our series this year of webinars sponsored by the National Watershed Coalition, and each one has had some very interesting information that we believe is quite helpful to our partners and our sponsors for the watershed program. One of the things that I wanted to point out to you is that one of the things that this is one of our responsibilities and agreements that we have worked with NRCS on to provide information to you all so that as you work through watershed sponsor issues, you know that there is an organization out there to help you, and we're also your voice when working with the watershed program. I'd encourage you to go to Facebook and like us, and that's where you get a lot of information about some of the programs that we're working on. And also, if you find these webinars very useful and helpful, that you would consider becoming a member of the National Watershed Coalition. Information about membership can also be found on our website. So thanks again, sit back and enjoy, and we look forward to hearing from Julie and Chuck. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, ma'am. The slide that's up right now, for those of you that may not be familiar with the Watershed Coalition, tells a little bit about us. As Lisa indicated, we advocate for the watershed program as delivered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we advocate for the local sponsors and partners who participate in that program. And we believe that watersheds are a natural and best unit for implementation of water resource work. Lisa is our chairperson. Rex Isom of Texas is our immediate past chair. Currently, our vice chair slot is open. and Barb Olgen of Kansas is our Secretary Treasurer. How are we governed? How do we operate? We're governed by a steering committee board of directors. It's composed of individuals and representatives from organizations and associations. As coalition would indicate, we're a collection of groups that come together to focus on our common interest on the watershed program. We do several things, not the least of which is conduct workshops and training sessions. With the current pandemic, those have started to take the form of webinars, which this is number 4 of a series, and we're glad you're here today. We serve as a resource to put sponsors in contact with others who've completed new construction or rehabilitation projects. Putting you in touch with other sponsors is an important part of what we do, and that's at least partly representative of our presenters that we have on board today. We provide assistance in developing strategies and sources for project funding, which is a focus of this. And we hold a biennial watershed conference. Our next one is scheduled for 2021. Theoretically, if we have a vaccine and folks begin to follow CDC guidelines a little closer, it will be an in-person meeting. If not, we'll be doing a virtual conference for sure. We have a number of publications that may be of value to you. You can find those on our website, watershedcoalition.org. They're there to be downloaded and utilized with various and sundry groups, so help yourself. We do maintain a website and a Facebook page. They are linked, so if you find us on Facebook, you can get to our webpage from there, and if you're on our webpage, you can get over to our Facebook page from there. There's our website. It's a good place to get information about things, activities that we're doing, which includes training, workshops, conferences, webinars, and other events related to Watershed Coalition work. Also, there are a series of watershed rehabilitation fact sheets there. Those are updated fairly regularly, but they are both how-to fact sheets as well as success stories for successful projects. We do a number of articles that feature watershed project work. And there are, in fact, some videos there. Again, there are resources there. Sometimes watershed sponsors find themselves on an island, and it's a little bit short on information, and so there are a number of fact sheets, all downloadable on our website that cover a number of topics that are relevant to the work that watershed sponsors do. In closing, I just want to say that you're going to get a look today at folks who have been successful in putting together partnerships. One of the things that we hear that's a common problem across the country is individual sponsors who don't have the amount of resources, either human resources or financial resources, to be successful in the watershed program. The folks you'll hear from today have made a professional charge at putting together partnerships and managing partnerships in order to be competitive and to complete successful watershed projects. So you're going to hear about their projects, but you might also want to take a 30,000-foot view and think about the things they say in terms of how it relates to the situation that you find yourself in. While it seems that partnerships should be a natural outgrowth where certain resources are lacking, they're not always there. Sometimes we get mired in our misery, if you will, when we are short on resources. And hopefully you'll find some inspiration today with Julie and Chuck in terms of putting things together and matching up with partners and managing a group of partners toward project success. Appreciate everybody getting up. I know some of you on the west are thinking about breakfast, and others in the east are thinking about lunch. And we certainly appreciate you taking time out of your work day to get on here and participate with us in this webinar. Thanks a bunch.
Well, thanks so much, Dan and Lisa, for those opening comments and information about our National Watershed Coalition. For logistics, all lines are muted except for our presenters. Our presenters will use their video also during the course of that, but you won't be seeing the normal amount of 112 smiling faces up there on the screen today. We'll just have the presenters with their video on. The questions that we'll use, and we had you practice this, use the dashboard on your computer, and you do that by tapping that orange arrow at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Go to the tap questions, type the question, tap send, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Our presentation is being recorded today, but that's no excuse not to have your paper and your pencil handy and really be taking a lot of notes. Dan offered to you that be thinking about where you're at with your projects or where you're at with the things that you want to get done, and jot down the ideas coming from Julie and Chuck and Dan regarding what you can use of what you learned today. The feedback is welcome to the address that you've been receiving emails from. My address at rayledgerwood@msn.com. So our agenda today is the opening comments, our agenda, and our session purpose. We're just about through that. If you're agenda checker, go ahead and check that off. And we're going to move right to Julie Davies O'Shea's presentation in just a bit. Questions and responses. Chuck Thomas's presentation, the questions and responses again, some closing comments. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. That'd be Julie Davies O'Shea. Julie is the Executive Director of the Farmers Conservation Alliance in Hood River, Oregon. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Ray. Can you hear me okay?
We got you just fine.
Perfect. Okay, shall I begin?
Yes, please.
All right. Let's see. Oh, there we go. I'm just trying to move back one slide. Well, I'll stay, there we go. I'm learning. Well, I have to admit, I really miss seeing all of your faces. I know it makes it better for Zoom and video presentations, but I'm looking forward to the day we can all be back in the same place together and building the connection and having those conversations in the hallway, because that is really the key to partnership, is more conversations, more opportunities for connection. And so I look forward to being in that space with you all here in the future. But first, I'd love to thank, as I'm getting started, Ray, Dan, and Lisa for giving me the opportunity to get to connect with everyone about the work FCA has been doing, as well as to share our lessons learned and our best paths for partnership that has evolved from our work over the years. I figured the best way for us to talk about collaboration and opportunities for implementation and partnership is by sharing the story, sharing the evolution of FCA, and to give you a sense for how FCA approaches our work and really what our worldview is. And really at the end of the day, it's about early planning. It's a lot of time investing in those partnerships and relationships, even on the smallest of projects, that allow us to build trust to move to the bigger projects, and finding that collaborative space that allows for the win-win solutions that creates benefit just not for the projects of agriculture, but also thinking about the environment and communities in which we work in. As I'm thinking about FCA's work, we were built on this foundation of collaboration and partnership, but now we're in this space where we're deploying more than $200 million of project capital, and looking forward, FCA is in the process of raising $1 billion for irrigation modernizations efforts over the next 10 years. Okay, with that said, let's get started. So let's see, perfect. I'm learning how to use these slides online. So FCA began in 2005 because of the Farmers Irrigation District and their invention of the farmer screen, which is a horizontal fish screen technology. Essentially, FID was struggling with an issue that's really common in Western agriculture. How do you divert water into your irrigation system without trapping debris and harming fish? To give you there it goes. Now, I know we have people from all over the country and different experiences within irrigation and agriculture. So I just thought I'd do a quick review of the basics to make sure we're all on the same page. But essentially in the Western United States, in order to grow food, because we don't get rain all summer, you have to divert water from a river or lake through a series of canals, and usually going into some pipes and sprinklers, and then out to the farm and ranch. Well, at that point of diversion, where the water is leaving the river and going into the canal, people often install a fish screen, or as they used to be called, debris screens. And the idea of this is to keep the fish sticks and leaves in the river, and then the clean water going into the canals and out to the farms. Now, this is one of the key pieces when thinking about collaboration, because when you put in a fish screen, we're allowing our endangered species and other aquatic animals to be able to stay in stream, but at the same time, we're reducing operation and maintenance cost for the landowner or the irrigation district. Now, in FID's case, at this point of diversion, they had a fish screen that didn't work very well. In fact, they had 13 of them. And part of this was that they had a high gravity system, and most of the fish screens designed were not set up for high gravity systems. Well, the result for FID was that they were spending $150,000 a year in operation and maintenance costs. They were still getting about 250,000 fish in their system. And then when that water was coming through the canal into the screen and out to the farm, along the way, they also had a small in-conduit hydro facility, a 5 megawatt hydro facility. And they had a very lucrative contract because they were part of the series of irrigation districts that were able to put in small scale hydro back in the early 90s. And so every time that fish screen was clogged, fish were getting injured or getting through the system when they'd have to lift it up to clean it through. Operation and maintenance costs were happening. And then they weren't producing hydro, which was how they were generating revenue to be able to modernize their system. So you can see when you're thinking about a well-running irrigation system, there's a benefit for farmers, there's benefits for fish, we can produce renewable energy, and there's a benefit to rural communities, right? That win-win-win is often the theme that we're looking for and how we're trying to stage and stack our projects. Okay, back to FID's story. So in 1996, this big flood came through and it ripped out all their infrastructure. And it really had forced them to really have to rethink about how would they rebuild this system? How would they do it in a way that could optimize fish protection, yet at the same time reduce their operation and maintenance cost? As Jerry Bryan, the former manager, used to say, they let fish be their guide, because they knew that if the fish could go through the system without getting trapped, it meant that their system could eliminate many of their operation and maintenance issues. So in their quest to figure this out, they went to the local tribes, they went to the agencies and nonprofits and said, look, we want to try to figure out a way to fix this system and make it work better. And essentially, it took them 10 years and they spent $2.5 million, and they invented what we now call the farmer screen. And to honor that collaborative relationship and the support and the trust that was built in the community to see this project through, they patented the technology. We formed FCA, which is a nonprofit organization, and they licensed the technology to us under condition that we get federal approval to install the screen, that we take the screen to market, that we sell as many screens as possible, and that we use any future profits to invest in other people and solutions that benefit agriculture, the environment, and communities. So you can see this collaborative partnership space is really at the core of our DNA, or core of our DNA. And to give you a sense of fish screens and thinking about Western ag and what the opportunity and how much need there is out there, here's some quick stats. Trying to make the slide go. There we go. So in the Western US, we have more than 1 million diversions. 80% of these are going to agriculture. when you think about those systems, most of them are 75 to 100 years old. So like the infrastructure in the rest of our country, they're really struggling. And the result of this is often these canals are losing 30 to 60% of the water. And not only does that mean you have to withdraw more water to make the system operate, and that the system's less dynamic, so being able to do water transactions and trades and all of these more modern water innovations that are coming up, it also requires a ton of energy to move the water. And so then you look at a place like Oregon, which is similar in many Western states, where we have 70,000 diversions. A study a while back came out and said that 75 to 90% of the diversions didn't have a fish screen. And so you think about from an ag side, and of course, that means high operation and maintenance cost in many of these systems. Or if you're wanting to pressurize your system, even more operation and maintenance cost. And then on a fish side, getting so many fish trapped. Again, back to that win-win solution. And yet when we think about modernizing our systems, the benefits are really extraordinary. It is one of the most incredible things that you can do in the Western United States when you think about a modern system allows for agricultural water security and reliability. It allows us to withdraw less water and therefore have improved river flows. We can manage runoff and improve water quality, open miles for fish and safe habitat and food security and economic development. And when we are looking to the future, what we see is that irrigation district of the future, and we're thinking about as we're putting capital in the ground to modernize these systems, and you're thinking about 1 million diversions, 80% of them going to ag. What are the other opportunities to increase the benefit and therefore the partnerships, and how we make these projects more impactful? And so some of the places we've been exploring is looking at, well, could we co-locate fiber optic and transmission lines, right? So if we think about these corridor of water systems, how do we think about this other benefit where often it's not cost effective to provide high-speed internet or cell phone service into rural communities. And yet now with COVID, it's more important than ever that we have high-speed internet because children are at home learning and telemedicine. And then long-term, we know that a significant amount of agricultural equipment is requiring data and connection. So could we provide that high-speed connection in? Or from a public safety standpoint, can we provide opportunities? We're also working a lot on fire resilience. And so thinking about here in the West where we've got these extraordinary fires, these corridors of water can also support firefighting activities and being able to help create stations for reloading water. Or we could think about with the transmission line, does it give an opportunity to bury some lines at a really cost efficient way in places that was typically cost prohibitive, right? So these are the pieces that we've been really thinking about. And as we fast forward from our start in this initial place, we're now in a place where we have 51 screens installed in 8 states, including on the picture here is the latest project we just put in, which is a 600 CFS, $34 million fish screen at the Derby Dam on the Truckee River, which is right outside of Reno. And what's exciting about this project is the Derby Dam was one of the first Bureau of Reclamation projects ever. And when they built the dam, one of the challenges became that it blocked off passage for the Lahontan cutthroat trout. It was later believed that the Lahontan cutthroat trout, I can't speak, the Lahontan cutthroat trout, or LCT, maybe that's easier to say, it was believed that they were extinct. And then a number of years later, they were able to find through DNA a match of this fish in another location. And so the regional tribes and US Fish and Wildlife worked together to rebuild a population, and they are just starting to release the LCT back into the Truckee River. And we worked with Bureau of Reclamation to put in this fish screen so that the LCT can go from Lake Tahoe to Pyramid Lake and back again, which was really exciting. And it was another great place to be able to collaborate and think about the agricultural resilience, the passage for the fish, and this win-win-win space. In addition, we've worked on a number of screens throughout the West, as I've said. Here's a couple quick views of different screen projects in different locations. And then a fun picture of a rancher working out in the fields. So as we were working on fish screens over the years, we started learning about these other needs that farmers and ranchers and irrigators had, especially when it was coming to irrigation modernization. And what we were often seeing is people were approaching us asking for help to think through beyond just the fish screen. How could they modernize their system? And so often they had such a high amount of need, but they weren't able to access the partnerships or the capital to turn that project into reality. And so what we were seeing often were a number of patterns that kept happening. We were seeing that people would spend years raising money for a project, for example, a fish screen, right? And then they'd go to install that screen only to realize that the pipe connection to the screen needed to be changed as also. And then they'd go back to work on that pipe and find out that the pipeline's going to run through a landowner's property who, in one case, was an attorney who did not want a new pipeline on their property. And here, this project we worked on for 4 years, spent all this time working on funding, the project stalled, right? Or on the other hand, we would go to these projects where the funding was there, we've worked on the project, we'd be bringing the fish screen out to it, and we'd get to the site and see that though the fish screen was going in, right next door was a passage barrier. And had we planned it all together for pennies on the dollar, we could have put in the fish screen and a passage barrier inside the river at the same time. Another scenario we kept seeing was groups of irrigators would come into us and say, look, we have to modernize our system in order to keep farming or ranching. And they had gone to a local engineering firm and had a quote to be able to modernize their system. And oftentimes on the low end, they'd be getting quotes back at 15 million, $50 million. And how were they going to navigate coming up with $15 million? It's 10 families. And what's that process going to be? And so as we kept seeing this process happening over and over again, we approached a number of partners, some agencies and nonprofits and water conservation districts, and tried to understand who's getting projects in the ground. How are they moving these forward in this paradigm where there's so much need, there's so much benefit? What were the dynamics that were actually making it happen? And one of the partners that we started talking about with was Energy Trust of Oregon. And we had a conversation with them about how are you helping projects get around? Because Energy Trust of Oregon had full funding to support agricultural energy conservation projects as well as generation projects. And what they were seeing is that even as they were able to fully fund these projects, very few were getting into the ground. And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? We're asking people who are managing the land, who are working on water systems, their jobs are really complex. These are sophisticated people who are able to move water and manage natural resources through extraordinary conditions. But when you think about what the difference is in that leap between modernizing agricultural systems and being able to actually implement upon them, what does it take? Well, it takes more than just the vision, right? It takes the partnerships, writing grant applications, building a plan, writing the permits, understanding the impact and the benefits, being able to effectively communicate and build a coalition around that, right? You think about those tasks, and even if every person was extremely capable and successful and had practice in doing that, there's just not enough time in the day. And so how do we increase that pre-project development support? And we were fortunate that someone like Energy Trust was coming to the table thinking about this as well. And so essentially what Energy Trust agreed to do was to provide FCA with the pre-development capital to build out a model around supporting irrigation modernization. And one of the things that we were really looking at is how do we build scale? How do we bring those lessons learned to more people and help bring the systems to accelerate the great work that they're already doing? And so essentially, we launched what we now call the Irrigation Modernization Program, which we launched 7 years ago, with the idea being that we work with irrigation districts or groups of irrigators or water diverters to help them plan out, raise money, and implement their irrigation projects. We were fortunate with Energy Trust investment because it really allowed us to create the scale and the ability to develop the systems and practices that were critical to being able to access the capital and implement upon it. The funding also allowed us to showcase at a national level the opportunity and potential of irrigation and modernization. And then as we were working with a number of districts and helping them plan out really this path to shovel-ready projects, we ended up doing a partnership with NRCS Oregon to develop watershed plans, which I'm sure many of you on the call know, but just in case, watershed plans in NRCS are essentially NRCS NEPA documents. And so when we realized that that was a critical tool to being able to access the PL 566 funds that allowed for mainline irrigation infrastructure changes, we were able to marry that initial capital investment of pre-development and the planning and all the work that had been building with a number of water communities, and then marry that with the NRCS efforts and going after the NEPA to get everyone in position for PL 566 funding. Now, to date, FCA is working with, I believe, about 30 irrigation communities to support modernizing their system. We're working with 55% of irrigated ag in Oregon, and in the last year, we replicated our program to support irrigation communities in California, Nevada, and Montana. And what's really exciting about this work, when we think about, see if I can flip this slide one more time. Oh, there, more construction pieces here. There we go. When we think about the districts that we're working with, and in particular, the very first 7 that came into the program, we were part of a team and we had built this coalition around modernizing their infrastructure systems that were, we helped raise $150 million to go to projects in the Deschutes Basin of Oregon. And these projects over the next several years, which are in construction right now, will not only install hundreds of thousands of feet of pipe, but will also put more than 200 CFS back in the Deschutes River for critical and endangered species. Of course, with funding scales like this, you can imagine what it's like for the local community and jobs, which is so critical right now. In this photo, you can see Senator Merkley here, along with former NRCS Chief Lohr and the irrigation district leaders, cutting the ribbon to start this great project. And it's a really fun space now to be in after all those years of work, is to start realizing some of these projects moving into implementation. Now, as we're looking forward on some of our early projects, oh, we're starting to video here. Ray, would you be able to hold it just for 1 second? Thank you. Now, as we're looking forward on some of our early projects, we see a time in the near future where we'll have more than 602 CFS of water secured in-stream for fish and habitat. We'll be able to support 350 miles of stream improvements and safe fish passage. We'll be able to support saving more than 70,000 megawatt hours of energy. And yet at the same time, we're working towards generating 40 megawatts of renewable carbon-free energy. And we're projecting all this work will result in supporting more than 24,000 jobs. But again, the reason that these projects are in the place they're in is really built on years of work, of working together and trying to think about what's the common benefit? How can we make these projects more beneficial for more people in the rural community? In celebration of the projects and the work in the Deschutes, we produced this video here, which we'll show you now.
To grow food in the Western United States, we built irrigation systems where the water pulls out from the river lake into a canal, out to smaller pipelines, into sprinklers or flood irrigating out to the farm. The challenge we're facing with these corridors of water, they're 100 years old. They're leaking 30 to 50% of their water. The Western United States has more than 1 million diversions. 70% of them, they're going to agriculture. Being able to modernize these systems is a great way to be able to address a number of agricultural security, food security, economic development, and environmental issues.
You're creating a whole series of benefits, and those benefits often are associated with increased economic production or to keep water in stream for fish, often providing recreational benefits that bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars to local economies.
In modernizing these systems, not only are you creating construction jobs and putting people to work, There's a lot of rippling effects on the environment.
Replacing our open canal systems with pipe is definitely a way to modernize our systems to deliver enough water to our customers and give back to the river.
During the recession, we were the only concrete trucks that were running, and we kept the lights on over a dozen different businesses, and as a result, you're able to stimulate the local economy.
It's getting to this space where we're thinking about where is this new mapping of infrastructure.
We've seen a lot of barriers in the past, particularly in scaling up this work. Some of those barriers relate to certainty of funding.
They're very expensive projects. How do you pay for a system like this? And it's a real challenge.
We can create a package of projects that's attractive to a wide range of funders, whether it's earned revenue opportunities, state and federal grants, or private investors. And that funding is critical to helping get some of these projects in the ground.
The whole landscape has been shaped by the development of water as a resource.
On our farm, we raise hybrid carrot seed. This area in Central Oregon is the biggest carrot seed producing area in the world. When we're competing with other countries or other geographies, we are not the lowest cost area of production. So we have to find other ways to give ourselves a competitive edge, and the way we do that is by being as efficient as possible.
We sell $42.3 million of agriculture annually in our community. More modern irrigation will be a benefit to our ranchers and our cattlemen.
We're entrusted with water, which is one of the most important resources on the planet, and so I think it's our duty to be as efficient with that resource as possible. Over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we can change the way that water is managed in the United States.
Looking at that network, not just for water purposes, but broader community benefits, will be a very key piece in looking at modern 21st century infrastructure across the western United States.
So coming back from that video and what I was saying earlier, if there's any advice that I could give on developing projects, it's don't focus on the money. All too often we hear people say they could do the project if they just had the money. But the truth is, after years of working on these projects with people, it's really about building the partnerships. It's about building the broad coalition. It's about figuring out how to increase the impact of these projects to create those win-win-win scenarios. Oftentimes we see people need more time in early planning and more time to build trust, more time to work on those smaller projects, being able to break down the big project into 20 smaller steps. So you get the experience and the opportunity to think about how to really build upon the work and accelerate with each other. Beyond the benefit of those systems, we like to think about how do those projects help the community as a whole? How does the investment able to help in our case, often rural communities? And then thinking about how we tell that story. How do we build more relationship? How do we spend more time building the connection so we can see that it's a place for unifying and a common ground that really elevates and benefits everyone? And as we work on these projects, that funding, that opportunity, those partnerships are really what makes the funding easier. It's what makes the funding happen and puts those projects in the ground. Thank you for your time and letting me speak today.
So important, Julie, what you gave us and the examples that you gave us. Oh my goodness, so good to hear those. I wanted to just to pose the question to you, if I might. The opportunity to get people together, you mentioned. And I'll ask the first question and invite other questions of our participants. So folks, now's the time, get on the questions dashboard to ask Julie some questions. Julie, you mentioned bringing people together of diverse interests and finding out what they want from a project. What techniques have you been using in your workshops? Are there specific questions you ask? Are there session designs that you've developed? What's been your experience in bringing people together to share those diverse ideas about benefits?
You know, when we first start working on a project, we have a practice where we meet with anyone possible that is connected to the project or living in the region. And what we do is we often try to have listening sessions. So we bring up the project we're working on and just get their feedback. And one of the key questions we often ask people is, how would you define success for this area or this project? And that question about what does success mean, it is often a really challenging question for people, because people can think in general that, you know, they know they want it to be better, but few people can actually define when they've achieved success. And so often we have that conversation with people of, well, if we're thinking about modernizing this piece, well, how much CFS is successful? Is it just some more water in, or is it 100 CFS? How do we know we've reached that point? And by starting to have these conversations and really listening sessions and documenting what someone says as opposed to telling them what we want the project to be, but hearing about what they think makes the project better, allows us to help in the project design, develop a project that's more beneficial for all and more inclusive, which helps elevate the project overall.
That's so enlightening. How would you define success from your perspective? Do you have them each write it down before they start to speak and then speak with one another, or do you have small groups working together? As a facilitator, I'm particularly interested, but I know our participants are interested in, wow, how do you make that magic happen in that room? You know, do you have them draw pictures like our tribal friends would do?
You know, we often, we found over the years that group conversations are important, and so are individual one-on-one conversations, because everyone has a different style of communicating. Some
Ah,
people are comfortable speaking up in a group, or, I mean, we all know there's people who like to speak the whole time, right? And so making sure each person's voice is heard, and sometimes the most quiet person in the room may be the most insightful or have that one piece of key information. So we often try to meet with people one-on-one to make sure we hear each person's voice individually. And then
yeah.
we also have group conversations. And, you know, often we find in these watersheds, there's many different groups. There's different people around the river or agriculture. And so we find there's often a lot of collective thinking and work already happening around the projects, and has been for a really long time. And so we try to thread that needle to help those projects happen and help the work that's been, you know, landowners have been thinking about for decades, and conservation groups and watershed councils, and they've been thinking about it. They just often need a little bit more energy or a few pieces of the puzzle to be added to help make that project go.
Wow, you know, I'm as listening to your project, and I'm reminded of my favorite question I love to ask groups of people when I get them together. What does it look like when it's working like it should?
It's
And I
so off. Let's go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, what does it look like when it's working like it should? And you must have uncovered that through the one-on-ones, right? And then through the group discussions, leading to that joint benefits, joint ideas. Yeah, I'm okay with that. If we do the fish, I'm okay with the water. If the fish folks are okay with the water, if we do the fish, and the fish folks, you know, the opposite. Wow, what a wonderful system. Yeah.
I find often when we're talking with people that it's easy to look around and say, this is what I don't like,
Hmm.
and this is what's not working, which is really important info to have.
Yeah.
But then when we say, okay, well, what would you do to make it better?
Hmm.
What's the most important piece? What's the most important part of the project? It really opens a different pathway and a different mindset to think about where that common ground space is. And I find at the end of the day, people love being a part of a project that not only benefits themselves, but others. They're
Hmm.
really proud of that. And we do want to find a way that we can do projects that creates more security and a healthy environment and a community and jobs. But we
Hmm.
also like the idea of helping other people. And when we can combine both of those worlds, it really creates an accelerant for projects to move forward and to implement.
The future is our friend. We haven't been there yet, so we can create it, huh? So here comes a question, another question. What is the timeline from the information gathering that you've just been talking about, to the start of construction? Specifically, how long did the NRCS watershed planning process take to put that NEPA style material together for PL 566? All of that, I think, is what the individual is asking. What's the timeline on some of these, been your experience?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is trying to work on how we shorten that timeline, right? Because once that spark has popped, that people are excited about a project, we want to figure out how to manage that spark all the way through implementation and be able to do that faster. We find on the watershed planning and the planning process, I would say it's typically 2 to 3 years, but we're working to figure out how to shorten that timeline. And of course, it depends. It depends on how much pre-development has happened within that water district or the irrigation community prior to starting the watershed plan process. Because if a lot of work has already been done, you can move into the process and really have the tools and assets you need to be able to move through the watershed planning phase and being able to get that down to under 2 years. And so that's one of the things that we're really looking for. When we first started on the watershed plans, we were definitely trying to work to a more accelerated timeline and push every piece we could as fast and as hard and quickly as we could through. And of course, we're still looking to do that, but we're trying to find ways of building out our system to be more efficient and to create less pressure on all the partners, and asking them to work through nights and weekends to get these projects through. So, yeah.
A good project knows no timeline, but you like to shorten that 2 to 3 years. That
Yeah.
seems reasonable, really, by the time that you would collect the data, get the people together, do the information gathering, and then get it into the Public Law 566 project pool and get it approved by all the necessary approval folks. And I bet I've got 115 folks on the line right now that have actually had some experience in some of that. So yikes, we could probably open that up for the entire group. Okay, so you said money doesn't count, but I got to ask you a money question. I'll ask this of Chuck too. How does an entity come up with local match when you can't match certain federal funds against certain federal funds? So there is some restrictions there depending on which part of the federal government the monies came from, whether you could match or not. So talk to the group about that. How did you find that local match?
Well, of course, that local match can be one of the hardest pieces, and especially when you're in a state like Oregon that doesn't have a lot of dollars at the state level. And we definitely put a lot of energy thinking about how we stack capital and manage that capital. And, going back to the story of Farmers Irrigation District, one of the reasons that we are looking at renewable energy and energy conservation is because it creates an opportunity to create an earned revenue stream. And so how could we help districts get in a position where they earned revenue? It's also why we're looking at these co-location opportunities. Is on one side, of course, that creates benefit for public safety and high-speed internet. But the other side is it can also create contracts for the irrigation district or a group of irrigators to earn revenue over cell phone tower fees. Or we spend a lot of time trying to think about where those benefits could also generate revenue to help pay for the system overall, because there is so much public benefit. We're often doing grants and loans at the state level, but as we found out quickly when we started working on PL 566, we had raised more money at the federal level than our state was able to match. And so we had to get really creative in thinking about it. With a number of districts, we work on long-term, low-interest loans, often 30, 40-year loans at a very low interest rate. And when we're modernizing their irrigation system, what we see in a number of cases is that their operation and maintenance cost is coming down to the same level of which a loan payment would be. And that loan would allow us to accelerate their projects and therefore have the match available so they're more competitive for the federal dollars. And so what we're looking at really on each of the districts we're coming into, and when we start off on our initial assessment, we're doing quite a bit of data collection. That was brought up in the last question, because many of the people we're working with don't have any data at all. And so we're doing LIDAR, GIS, water loss, energy consumption. And as we're going through this process, we're trying to identify where those earned revenue opportunities are, as well as opportunities for reducing operation and maintenance costs to allow for either those loans or different type of funding mechanisms.
Excellent. Let's change gears to regulators for a bit. How were the regulators on the state and federal level brought into the planning process? Were they in those one-to-ones you had? Were they into the group meetings you had? How did you involve those regulators in the process?
Well, we find that often the regulators have had a long history around many of these projects, and they've been trying to figure out a path forward, right? They're trying to find those common ground solutions themselves. And so when we start working with a new water community or irrigation district, right in the beginning, we go have a conversation with key agency partners, tribal partners, the regional nonprofits, and start asking those questions. And oftentimes they have really innovative solutions and ideas, or I heard a long time ago that the difference between a successful project and one that doesn't work is often 1 degree, right? It's just a slight change in the system. And often in those conversations, you learn, maybe this agency could help, but you got to get your paperwork in, 18 months prior. And so it helps us build out the timeline and planning necessary for supporting the project implementation. And of course, because we're working with a number of irrigation districts, we can take those lessons learned from one district to the other and know, we can probably guess some of the pieces, but it never takes the place of those individual one-on-one listening sessions to help build a relationship, and in particular, the trust. And that's why those smaller projects are so important, because it just starts building the trust that's so essential to help these projects accelerate.
Wow, that must be something when you pack those one-on-one conversations back in, and you hold the confidence and trust of the people you had the one-on-one conversation with, but you're sharing that in the group setting. That must be quite a task, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so how much do you share what you talked about and the frustration of a regulator, maybe, right? To try to get going, man, to take down the barriers, right? Even the personality and social science barriers, right? If a regulator has been working with a group for a long time without success, right? And now all of a sudden you're asking them to be successful.
Oftentimes we find coming in, sometimes bringing a new person in to ask and listen, you
Mm-hmm.
hear the same conversation in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And really what we're doing is building bridges between communities and helping us be more empathetic with each other. Oftentimes we'll work with a farmer or irrigator, and they're really frustrated about a local or a state or a federal agency partner. And then you go and talk with that partner and you realize it's really not about the person, it's what they're having to manage. And yes, they feel frustrated about that too,
Mm-hmm.
but they can't change the law. That's how the law is set up.
Right.
And so it helps take us out of that place to be able to become more empathetic of, okay, what can't they do? But then on the other hand, what can they do?
Yeah.
And we see the same thing happening from a farmer to an environmental standpoint around water and stream. But a lot of times if you have those early conversations, you find out, on one side you put a fish screen in the ground because it protects fish. On the other side, you put the same screen, but the debris screen in the ground because it reduces operation and maintenance costs. Same screen, same project, different language used to articulate success.
Outstanding. Now I'm going to ask for a short answer to this question. I'm going to move to Chuck. And how are you funded? How is FCA compensated for your work you do? Are you state-funded agency? And I think you mentioned this in the very open front end, right? That you're not a state government entity, you're not a government entity, you're a private organization. So how are you funded?
We're a private organization, so we're a nonprofit. And in reality, the first decade of our existence, we scraped by, and because we had the fish screen technology, we were selling fish screens, and the idea is the revenue would support us, but those projects take a really long time. Our sales cycle was 3 to 10 years. And so we were looking at how do we shorten that timeline and also help people get projects in the ground. In the beginning, we were debt financed for most of our work. And now we're supported predominantly through screen sales and consulting contracts with partners. And sometimes those contracts are covered by private funding or state funding or federal funding, depending on who we're working with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, good. We're glad you're in a better spot now, I trust, huh? And that's good. Now, what I'm doing is I'm handling these questions, sending out the responses, your responses back out to everyone, encouraging them to keep those questions coming. But Julie, take a rest, grab a cup of coffee or something. We'll come back to more questions after Chuck's presentation, if you don't mind.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So Chuck, let's do a sound check, and we'll draw you up back into the program now. And we appreciate all those questions coming in. Please keep them coming in. There's lots of questions that we have, and we're sure you're going to have some specifically for Chuck and for Julie. It's my honor to introduce Chuck Thomas, Executive Engineer, Southern Sandoval County Arroyo Flood Control Authority, Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Chuck, welcome. So good to see you, and let's test out our technology and make sure it's working okay.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for the introduction. And let's
You're
see.
welcome.
Make sure the mouse works here. Working on it. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, Dan and Lisa, for the opportunity to present to everyone, and thanks for everyone tuning in. So I'm the second presenter, acquiring and managing project funding with successful partnerships for successful projects. So let's see, why do you need funding? And so this is an important question for everybody out there that's looking at getting funding. And you really ought to have an idea of what it is, why do you want to go through this process? And there's a reason. It's because when you start down this path of funding and you start looking at these projects, sometimes you feel like you're the only one on the working end of that shovel at Churchill Downs after the Kentucky Derby, you know, and the process in front of you just seems, you know, very long and arduous, and you may want to despair. So you better have some good motivation behind you when you want to start moving forward on that process. So I'll give you a little bit of background about us and why I got started in this whole business of trying to seek out funding. So SCAFCA, the agency with the horrendously long, complicated name, basically we're just a simple flood control agency. That's all we do. We're charged with regional flood control in Southern Sandoval County. We were created in 1990. So basically in our area, development had a 40-year head start. So it really put us behind the 8 ball because none of the property or the development that occurred really had a significant amount of attention to flood control. So you think, well, why would they do that? Well, out here in New Mexico and Rio Rancho, we average, you know, about 9 inches of rain a year. So for most people, you know, they can go a long time without seeing a storm event. They really don't think about it that way. In the current year, it's a particularly impactful year with drought. I think we're only around 5 to 6 inches so far this year. So it's been a rough year for folks here. Many of the irrigators could probably speak volumes about how little water there is to go around. So for us, when we really started sitting down and looking at what do we need to do, we had about 4,000 acres we needed to acquire, which is about $39 million, and about $78 million in flood control just in the next 15 years. So we didn't want to look at the whole jurisdiction. We just said, well, where are people today? Where would they expect them to be? And let's figure that out. And our annual budget is about 2.2 million. So that's not going to get us there very quickly. So we said, okay, we're going to have to go out and look for some additional funding. So I want to go over some of the alternative funding options, just the benefits and limitations that are associated with them, and then strategies to help build those successful partnerships. So we'll kind of run through all of these. So the first thing, I know, Julie, you said, you know, don't focus on the money. And I think the partnership, you know, really encompasses more than that. But at the heart of it, you do need to find some of that money to make the project work. So, you know, the first thing is do your research. You know, do you know your state funding sources? Do you know your federal programs? So you need to sit down and start looking around and asking those questions. Research your local state programs, research the legislation, figure out what's going on out there, and then research the federal agencies themselves. What are they funding? What are their sources of funding that they have? Websites. Back in the day, a long time ago, before this thing called COVID, you used to be able to go sit and have a cup of coffee with somebody and have a conversation. Obviously, that's not as accessible today. Hopefully, it will be again here in the following year. But that's a great way, just kind of have a conversation. Grants.gov, I did want to mention that as a website. I put the link on there. That has basically all the federal funding sources that are out there that they put out are listed on that website. It can be a pretty daunting website to look at. So one of the key things to try to identify is your CDFA number or your catalog of federal domestic assistance number. So every program is going to have a number, and there's a keyword search by that number. So you can plug that in and it'll bring up all the list of funding opportunities associated with that. So for example, the RCPP program, the CDFA number is 10.932. It's just something you can plug in and try to focus in and target, because that grants.gov is going to cover every federal agency, every federal program throughout the United States. So a lot of it isn't going to apply, and it's hard to sift through that, unless you're a glutton for punishment and you like staring at very small lettering on computer screens. So I wanted to run through just some of the state funding sources that we have here in New Mexico, just to kind of give you an idea of what we looked at and what we've benefited from. The first one is your legislative special appropriation, your capital outlay, otherwise known as PORC. It's a 100% grant. And I will step on a soapbox very briefly about this, to just mention that, a lot of folks say, oh, funding really needs to be allocated by a formula. There needs to be a process so that we can ensure that, the person who's getting the money is the most deserving. The problem with all of those activities is when you set up a funding criteria ranking system, that system is automatically going to target one type of project, one type of entity is always going to come out at the top, and some other projects are always going to come out near the bottom. So in a way, those systems tend to be somewhat self-selecting as well. So it adds kind of a complication to it. The real benefit of the legislative special appropriation, or being able to go talk to your local legislator, is you're getting to tell a story. You're getting to kind of explain why you need the money. And that ability applies to everyone, whether you're just the local individual and you're working on your own, or you're the large, municipality, city of Albuquerque or city of Portland or whatever. Everybody gets to be one-on-one with that legislator. So it kind of helps level the playing field. So I strongly support those processes. We have speaking of ranking systems, we have a water trust board that uses a ranking system for a portion of the funds every year from the legislature that's designed for water-based projects. A lot of it is for water supply, but others can be used for flood prevention and watershed restoration. So that's a pretty good source, 75% grant, up to 85. We have the Rural Infrastructure Program and the Public Project Revolving Fund. Both of those are loan projects. But the loan interest rate right now is very low. Most of them are between 0 and 1%, what you're seeing there. So something to consider. Obviously, it's not a chunk of funding that's available, just right out, in a big bag, but and you have to pay it back. But if the interest rate is low enough, sometimes that's a really good source of funding to consider. Some of the other state funding sources. So community development block grants, any of you have heard of those, the CDBG program. It is federal funding, so it comes from the Housing and Urban Development, and it comes down to the local counties and municipalities within your state. It's generally how it's parceled out. The real benefit for that funding is that it loses its federal designation. So, the color of the money, how it behaves can be divided up between your federal and your state and local requirements. So the nice thing about the CDBG funding is that when it comes down, it kind of loses that federal designation and becomes basically state money. So you can work with your local county to access some of those. There's an application period every year. Economic development funds. I know Julie had mentioned that in her presentation, and I think it's important to look at what is going to benefit your local community. And many counties and cities and other organizations have these economic development funds designed to, entice businesses to come in and put in, benefit the economy in your area. And so some of your projects, depending on what they may involve, or if they can work into the recreational community or other aspects, you can go talk to those folks and say, hey, I think I'm bringing a benefit that's going to last beyond this project. And so see if they can provide some of the funding as well. I had mentioned early on looking at legislation. So one of the programs that passed a couple years back was the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act. So when you look through the legislation, you find out, oh, they're setting up a funding source for this. So again, it's not something that was, really publicized very well, unless your particular area. But if you go in and look around and try to find it, you can identify some of these funding sources that are available. Federal funding sources, we'll go through these real quick. There's a lot of acronyms here, so my apologies for living in acronym land. That's kind of the way it works. Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. You have the Emergency Watershed Program, the Watershed Ops, or the PL 566. EQIP, RCPP, and you have all those programs, which some of you may or may not be as familiar with. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. So you have the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. You have the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, which has now been renamed as BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And that's kind of changed things around a little bit. Federal Highway Administration has a lot of funding. The one unique thing about FHWA funding is that it usually comes down through your metropolitan or rural planning organization. So there should be an organization somewhere in your state, or multiple organizations in your state, that are focused on distribution, either at the metropolitan level for municipalities or in the rural areas for funding that comes down through FHWA. Of course, most of that's associated with roadways, but dam embankments make great roadways. And so, the TIP and the TAPS, that's Transportation Improvement Program, and the Transportation Alternative Program. So transportation alternative is trails and other means to encourage non-vehicular traffic. So for us in flood control, we've used that, for trails alongside of our arroyos that we use as access points. So now we have an ability to get in and maintain our systems. And when we're not doing it, then the general public can use it as a trail system. So all of the funding sources that I'm showing here are funding sources that we have worked with in some degree or another. Some of the other funding sources, Environmental Protection Agency, they have a Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. Depending on how your state turns it out, sometimes there's a grant component as part of it. But again, right now the interest rates are down around 0 to 1%. So it becomes very economically viable that way. Of course, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they have a lot of authority with funding for projects that we've done on the flood control side. Continuing Authorities Program, which is at the local level, Section 14, and then Environmental Infrastructure, Section 595. And then if you're out here in the West, the Western 17 states, I believe, the Bureau of Reclamation does have a lot of projects and funding sources on the Water Smart grants. Some of the other federal funding sources that we've worked with, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that's a 50-50 split between grant and match. And generally the key there is to get connected with your state conservation and outdoor recreation plan, or the SCORP. So that'll be through your state parks department. So if you want to find out about land and water conservation funding, contact your state parks department, and they should be able to help you out with that. And then National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWIF, which has urban waters grants and then additional grants through their corporate partners. So there are a lot of funding sources out there at the state level, at the federal level. And that now we start looking at some of the private funding sources, of course. You've got corporations, you've got Facebook, Intel, Amazon, Honda. We've worked with Facebook right now. We're working on a project where Facebook funding was applied for by the Nature Conservancy, and we're partnering with them. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm also on the board of the local Little League, Petrigrove Little League, and Honda has grants for Little Leagues, you know, to go out there and improve their fields and do work. So there's a lot of opportunity. These corporations usually have a funding arm out there to provide grants and other support to the local communities. Banks, we worked with Wells Fargo to get funding for projects. As I mentioned, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society, and others, they have an ability to provide funding or provide expertise. And then local companies and local developers. We're working with projects right now with some of the local developers. You know, they're putting in homes and trying to put in a business park and everything, and they want to promote, you know, their development. So many times there's a way of saying, hey, we've got this great access path along our drainage structure that makes a really good nature trail. Wouldn't you love to be part of that? Wouldn't you love to help fund that? We can put sponsorship signs or something on there. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it, and a lot of different sources out there. So let's look at the benefits. Well, more money, right? I mean, that's one of the keys. If you're trying to get from point A to point B on a project and you don't have the funding to get there, then this is a great way to get that money. So hopefully this whole thing isn't turning into like drinking from a fire hose with all those federal funding sources. I don't want you to worry about that. We're going to dig into working with them now, looking at that. So some of the benefits that you can see beyond just getting the money is project planning timelines can be approved. Now you're going to say something a little bit later on that's going to seem to kind of conflict with this, but what we're talking about is when you expect to get the project done. And, you know, as I mentioned originally, you know, our budget is a little over $2 million a year, but if I'm going to build out $78 million in flood control, it's going to take a very long time. So every year that we don't build a project, the people downstream of that area remain at risk for a flood event that could occur. And so every year that passes, you know, we're rolling the dice to see if someone's going to get flooded, if someone's going to get hurt, if their property is going to get destroyed. So the sooner that I can build that project, the sooner I can put those elements of protection in place and people don't have to worry anymore. So when you have access to additional funding, you can start accelerating that timeline a little bit and say, okay, well, maybe I can do this project a little bit sooner because now I've identified that funding. It conserves additional funding that internal funding that you may need elsewhere. So although you may have some operating capital that you normally spend with operation and maintenance or whatnot, suddenly you're thinking, well, I got to get this done. I'm going to, you know, rob Peter to pay Paul here. We're going to make this work. We're going to get something done. Now you don't have to worry about that. You can keep those funds dedicated where they needed to be, and it can relieve the stress on kind of managing what you have to kind of put food on the table, so to speak, for your entity. One of the other aspects is that staff time may be eligible for reimbursement. So in particular with FEMA, we've worked with FEMA on a number of projects, and the great thing is the time that we put in for managing the project, the time that we put in, you know, overseeing the construction of the project, all that time, as long as we're tracking our records correctly, we can submit that for reimbursement. So now where we had an operating budget expense projected of, you know, so many dollars to cover this person's, you know, position for a full 28, 80 hours a year, now all of a sudden we can defray 400 hours of that effort. So that's a savings that we can kind of roll back into our budget or use elsewhere. So that's really key. And the biggest benefit really is the planning, design, and construction can be completed. And that's a huge benefit. As I mentioned, when we build the flood control project, the people downstream of that don't have to worry anymore. When you get your improvements in place, you don't have to worry about that anymore. So it's done. And there's that's kind of a powerful thing to be able to say, hey, we got this done, we finished the project. And it's economic development. As that construction process is going on, I think in the video that Julie played, they talked to the one concrete company that was producing material. They stayed in business during the downturn because there was a project out there that needed what they were producing. And so there's all that benefit, that rolling benefit from these projects that you have to acknowledge, and it's really important to recognize. And not to mention the external funding that comes into your jurisdiction. So when that external funding comes in and the contractor's buying the supplies locally, spending the money locally, his crews are in hotels locally, they're going to restaurants locally, all that money wouldn't have been there if you hadn't gotten the external funding in the first place. So it's important to remember those benefits. There we go. Some of the other benefits are additional expertise. You have an idea, you're putting together the documentation, you turn it in and you get comments back. This is good. You're getting outside review. It's helping to validate your project. It's basically forcing you to kind of bring your A game to the situation. So I'd mentioned that we've received funding through FEMA. So we've worked with our local state agency, that's the primacy agency. And we'll turn in applications and they'll send back questions saying, hey, what do you mean by this? Hey, what's going on here? And you look at it, you go, okay, I need to do a little bit better job on this. I need to polish this up. Let's make this application sparkle. So it really kind of helps you, and you need to look at it that way. When you're getting these comments back or you're getting this, don't look at it as criticism, looking at it as improving your product. This is making it better, because now we're answering these questions. We're making it a much more solid document or application or whatever it is you're working on. Sometimes you can add additional community benefits. So many of the funding sources will be, again, asking for, well, what else are you doing as part of your main project? So you've got your main project here, and then you're saying, okay, well, I can add on these other pieces over here. I can add in that trail system. Now we're going to use it as an access path, but it's a trail system. So that counts. So you can add these additional community benefits in as part of the project. You get increased public awareness. All that funding is reported by the agencies. They need to document where all the money went. So all that gets put together in reports. You can present that to your governing bodies of your local town council. You can present it to state legislators and whatnot and say, look, see here, it's listed right here. And I think one of the other kind of esoteric elements is you're in the club. If you successfully bring in external funding, you've got that success tucked into your belt. You look at a lot of the sports teams that are very successful year in and year out, and you're like, why are they so successful as compared to others? Well, they figured it out. They figured out how to be successful. And then when new people come into the program, they look at the wall and they go, wow, there's a lot of trophies there. They figured this out. And so they start to believe. They go, oh yeah, I'm going into a great organization and I'm going to try better. I'm going to do better work and I'm going to succeed. So once you've had that first success and you've gotten that, you're kind of in the club. And now you can go, okay, now I'm going to move on to the next one. This is old hat. I got this. So let's look at the other side, limitations and considerations. The first one is loss of control. So when you gain some of that external funding or you start getting that application, you say, okay, we got the grant agreement, we're great, we're good to go. Those external funding agencies are going to have oversight and some control of your project. They want to make sure that that funding is spent according to what they need to report and that it matches their requirements for funding. So that's just par for the course. That is part of the game. Those agencies need to kind of satisfy their metrics and make sure what you're doing is in compliance. So that's just something you're going to have to deal with on that part of the process. And it's just, it's just like anything else. If it was your money, you'd want to be kind of keeping an eye on it. Well, they're doing the same thing. The same thing during the process. When you get additional services for engineering or change orders for outside approval, you have to kind of route those up the chain, route them up, make sure there's no issues, make sure there's no problems with the funding agency that's providing funding for you. Additional paperwork. So everybody's favorite thing, lots of paperwork. So you have to use the forms and the databases from the agencies. You have to learn their tools, learn what their nomenclature is. What does that mean? What does box 7 mean? It's like you get your tax form. You go, okay, fill in box 8. I got to turn the sheet over here. What does box 8 mean? Oh, blah, 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 blah. And you got to figure that out. Documentation of expenditures and activities. As I mentioned, one of the benefits is that we can get our staff time reimbursed. The corollary is we have to have a timesheet system that tracks it sufficiently so that we can document how folks are spending their time, and we can prove to the agency, yes, they did do this work. It's not a huge deal, but it's something to consider. Increased staff time. So when you do get these funding sources in, of course, somebody has to complete the paperwork, somebody has to be the point of contact for the funding agency. So now they're having to kind of add a few hours to their week. Increased cost of the project. You know, the overall cost may increase. A couple of different examples. You may be tied to federal wage rates. You know, that's part of the you know, what you have to deal with federal funding coming in. The contractors are going to have to pay different wage rates, so that may increase the cost of your project, or you may have to put in elements that you weren't expecting. So we had a project that we were seeking FHWA funding for. We were constructing a dam, and in order to get the funding, we had to build a roadway on top of it. Well, as you can imagine, if you build a dam without a roadway, it's going to cost one thing. If you build the dam with a roadway on top of it, it's going to cost entirely another. So you have to decide, is it worth it? You know, with that extra cost. And then there's a time limitation on funding. Most of that funding will expire typically between 3 to 5 years after it's been issued. A lot of agencies have an opportunity for extensions of time, but they do get harder and harder if you go back to the well, so to speak, for more extensions. So really try to focus your expenditures within that time frame. And then increase project timeline. So on the one hand, you can advance projects to be completed much sooner than you thought, but the project itself may take additional time. So now you have additional procedures. There was a brief mention of NEPA. Well, you've got to go through all that evaluation. You've got the extra time for the funding agency to approve submittals. It may be a few days, it may be longer, but it's just additional time you got to work in, or additional advertising. So in some cases, if you have local funding, you can go with an on-call contractor. You can be underway in a couple of days. With federal funding sources, a lot of times you have to do a 3-week advertisement. So you have to build all these pieces in. And then the other aspect of increasing your timeline is understanding your application requirements and being aware of the timeline from the application to award. Ray, I know you'd mentioned that question to Julie, and so this really kind of hits it. So one of the programs that we applied for was the FEMA pre-disaster grant program in 2019, and the application was due earlier this year on January 31st of 2020. No problem. Get through the holidays, put it together, turn it in. Oh wait, there's more. The state deadline in order to review your application and make sure it's got all the pieces and parts put together was November 30th of the prior year in 2019. Okay, now I got to back that up a little bit. Oh, the notice of interest is due on October 23rd. Okay, now I got to back that up another 6 weeks for when I have to start kind of putting that together. But wait, as part of your notice of interest, you may need a resolution from your board or other governing body. For us, the closest board meeting was on the 17th of October. So now we had to have that on the 17th. But you have to present it to the board, you know, a month ahead of time, so they're all comfortable with it and familiar with it. So now you're looking at September, and then we have to prepare all the presentation, get all that documentation in place. So when we started looking at that application date of January 31st in 2020, really, we started working on that back in August of 2019 to get us to that point. And this is just to apply for the funding and to meet all those. So I think Julie mentioned it and Ray brought it up, but you really need to look at your timelines and see, you know, there's that outside deadline of when the funding application is due, but then, you know, when do you have to start work on that project? And then the award of the grant was November 4th of this year. So again, there's that timeline, you know, almost a year and a half from the application process through the award just to kind of get there. Other limitations and considerations, advanced spending. So you may have to prepare some of these materials up front. Do you have a preliminary engineering report? Are you going to need to do one? With FEMA, you have to do a benefit cost analysis. They have a program that you run to put that in. So those costs, you know, are something you'll have to do without ever any guarantee of getting the money. And then you have floating reimbursement. Most external funding operates on a reimbursement process. So you have one of two ways to go about it. You can either pay the contractor and then turn in that payment to the agency for reimbursement, so you're on the hook for that funding until they pay you. So you've got to be able to kind of cover that capital. Or the contractor does the work and you say, okay, thanks for your work. And then you take their pay application and you turn it in directly to the agency and say, okay, well, we think they should get paid. And that puts the burden on the contractor. Both of those have pros and cons. Obviously, the contractor is going to want to get paid sooner rather than later. And so that may affect how he bids it if he knows that's what's going on. But you have to kind of figure it out and work on it. So remember that? So we went through a lot of those issues and problems, and it probably sounds all horrible and rotten, but there were those benefits that you had at the beginning of it. So just remember that you're going to be going through this. So preparation. So you want to put this together, you want to dig into that, but you don't want to do it without really making sure you can be as successful as possible. So the first thing is cost time comparison. Looking at the fact that there are those delays built into the system, can you do it without the funds or not? And when do you need it completed? If you've got a project that you need to do like 2 months from now, it's got to get done and it's emergency, there's very few funding sources that are going to move that quickly. So you better take those projects, put them aside, and try to get it done very locally. If you do have time to get things done, okay, now you can move forward. That's step one. And then compare the project to the funding source. What's the purpose of the funding agency? What do they need? What are they really looking for? What are they working on? It's kind of like dating. You want to put on your nice clothes. You want to kind of look and say, well, what are their interests? Are they Pisces? I'm a Taurus. Oh no, that's not going to work. So you really want to look at those things and figure it out, and figure out which agency is the best match for you on that funding source. And then really important is compare your request to the available funds. So we've been very successful with the state legislature on capital outlay because we're not greedy. So if the legislators each have, let's say, $1 million to distribute, and you've got 5 legislators in your jurisdiction and everybody's coming to them for their funding, and you ask for $5 million, your chances of success are going to be 0. And you're probably going to get them mad because they're like, dang it, now you're making us look like the bad guy. We got to turn you down. We don't want to do that. We want to be the nice guy. We want to hand out the money to you. So really tailor your request to the funding that's out there and take a look at it. Identify your project scope for funding. What's the scale and modularity? What are you trying to accomplish with this? Is it just going to be, the preliminary engineering report? Is it planning? Do you have the engineering done and you just want to fund the construction? So you kind of need to figure out what is it that you really want to use this funding for. One thing I'll just mention, just as an aside, phase is kind of a 4-letter word, and most funding agencies will kind of give you the hairy eyeball when if you use like, this is phase 1 of such and such, because they're like, well, what does that mean? Is there going to be a useful part of the project that's completed at the end of this phase? So I always recommend, say, use upper or lower or west, or this is the blue section, and we'll be dealing with the purple section on the next application. But the idea is you want to have a complete project. Whatever you're funding, there's going to be something at the end of that is going to be something you can say, look, it's been built, or look, here's the document. Whatever it is, you want to have that kind of endpoint kind of built in. And as I mentioned, what's the best use of the funding? Is it for acquisition of property or right of way? Is it best for planning engineering? Is it good for construction? And the more of those that you can kind of limit, the better off you are, in a sense, and that you've got less complications. Dealing with engineers and what the funding agency wants to see is going to be different than a contractor and what the funding agency wants to see. So just look at that and what work could be done in advance. Sometimes it's beneficial, sometimes it's not. Identify your matching component, and I think this gets into another question you brought up, Ray. Matching fund sources, like generally doesn't match like. So you don't want to, for us, like for the Water Trust Board, you can't use legislative funds to match Water Trust Board funds because those are also essentially legislative funds. So it's just like 2 magnets. You can't put the 2 positive ends together. They're not going to line up. So you want to find funding that matches up well. Right of way can be a great match. If you've already acquired the property, sometimes it's as simple as getting an appraisal. You get with a local realtor who certifies appraisal and say, hey, what is this property worth as a commercial property or whatever? And they give you a document that says, oh, it's worth, $85,000 or $1.2 million. And you go, okay, here's my match, and see how they work with that. Some do. In-kind resources. Have you spent a lot of time on that? And again, here we get back to that tracking time. track your staff time. If you put a bunch of time in to put together a document, you can hold that up as a match and say, we've done all this work, and here's our kind of payroll records to show how much work we've done, and here's the documentation. So all these things can be used for match. But you may not have any match. You may not have anything. Well, it can be tough. But no, you're not really. It just means you have to approach things a little bit differently. You have to tell your story. You need to say, this is why we need funding. You need to go talk to people. Julie had mentioned that, the one-on-one conversations with folks. Find your seed source. Is it your local legislator? You know, who's going to lend you that sympathetic ear? Is it a private company? Maybe it's a local Dairy Queen. It's like, hey, Bob, I know you got the Dairy Queen and you employ all the high school kids and whatnot, and you get that going. We'll be happy to put a sign for your business on the main highway coming in on a piece of property we own if you can help us with this little bit. And, you know, pledging other resources. You're committing to complete the project. You need to demonstrate that you're committed to doing the work. Commitment to operation and maintenance. Don't worry, once it gets built, we've got it covered. We've got staff in place. We've got a plan. We know how we're going to handle this. Maybe it's commit to assist with construction. Maybe you have some equipment. We're going to handle some of the grubbing. You know, we're going to clear off all the vegetation because that's what we have equipment to do. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of slice it and put it together and present. So even if you're not coming in with a big stack of Benjamin's, Franklin's, you know, you've got other resources that you can use. Exchange of services, as I mentioned, the kind of the quid pro quo. Well, if you help us out, maybe there's a local construction company, their folks are idle or they've got some free time. Hey, if you come help us here, we'll help you. Volunteer organizations, scouts, schools, youth conservation corps, prison services. There's a lot of resources out there where people are looking for activities. My son in high school has to provide service hours. So he's been down at the Little League field, kind of helping winterize the fields, cleaning up, you know, leaves and weeds and all that kind of stuff. And he's getting credit for it because it's a service to the community. So contact the local high schools. Do they have a service requirement of their students? You can also look at other organizations. The City of Rio Rancho Fire Department here locally, they wanted to build a wildfire fighting crew. But they said, one of the problems we have is we don't have any experience with wildfire stuff because we've been all urban. So they said, hey, can we work with you and use some of your property? We'll go move dirt for you because we've got our wildfire fighting tractor and we want to get hours logged on it. So can we go work in your facilities? And we said, sure, go right ahead. You're building that goodwill. You're providing that opportunity. And then partnerships, of course, one of the main points of this whole presentation is partnerships. And many grant funds require partnerships. They say, oh no, you gotta have a partnership. That's one of the ranking criteria in here. So you're excited, right? Because I know what everyone's thinking here when they're thinking of partnerships. Oh, great. I gotta go work with a whole bunch of clowns all at once and figure this out and do what they're gonna do. And so it's not that. It's not that. Sometimes it's just a single partner. Sometimes it's that local business. And it doesn't have to be, the whole projects thing here is scalable. It can be a very small project that you're partnering on. It can be a letter of support, you know, from a local entity saying, yes, we really want this project to go through because it's going to help us or it's going to help the community in X, Y, and Z. It can be done in steps. You know, a lot of times I mentioned it's that the Dairy Queen owner, your partnership is that one-on-one to get this one piece. And then you can take that one piece and move it to the next step and say, okay, that I got that done. That's great. Now we need to move it to the next step. Now we can work with the Nature Conservancy, or now we can work with a local developer that needs dirt or something like that. So when you look at partnerships, it's not about getting everybody in a big group of room and it's like, oh yeah, we're all going to partner all at once, all together. You can build it incrementally over time, just one at a time, hit it, and then move on to the next piece. So it doesn't have to be this big scary monster concept of partnering. Leveraging your partner's strengths. I mean, this is a great thing. So I mentioned that we partnered with the Nature Conservancy, and one of the things that we want to do is do some work and improve an outlet structure. And they're like, oh, well, we don't really know anything about that, but this funding source requires a lot of public outreach. And I'm like, great, we're a bunch of engineers. We don't want to do public outreach. And they're like, well, we love doing the public outreach. And I'm like, great, you do all the public outreach. We won't. And so that's how it worked out. So they're doing that piece of it because they like doing that. We're doing the other piece. And that's really one of the keys. What is it that their agency is focused on or that partner is focused on? What do they geek out about? Let them do that. They're excited to do that, and you do the other stuff or work with somebody else. Do they have specialized equipment or resources? You know, hey, we're trying to put a plan together, but we don't have somebody that can print a giant sheet of paper. You know, all we have is our 8.5 by 11 printer. So wouldn't it be great if you could find somebody that would say, hey, yeah, we got a giant printer, we'll let you use it, or we'll print stuff out for you for free. So again, it can be at a very small level or large. Some of the partnership examples we've done, Sandoval County, we've actually partnered on a road project. So we said, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll put in the drainage, you put in the asphalt, and it's all good. We're below ground, you're above ground, everybody works together. It's a great, easy project. The community college, we had to get some of their property to build a dam. So they donated the property and they said, hey, can we put an educational trail system on your property? Sure, that's not a problem. If that's what you want to do and it's not impacting our operations, go for it. And we were able to get the property donated. With the local city, right-of-way exchange. So when we're consolidating property and roads get cut off, hey, why don't you just donate that right-of-way to us? You're not using it anymore because we bought up all the property all around the road. So just donate it to us, and now we can incorporate that into our project. Or they'd use their CDBG funds to help support us in areas where those funds are applicable. So there's a lot of ways to work with your public entities and, of course, private partnerships. We've had a number of facilities, Lomitas Negras, where the adjacent property owner wanted to develop his property, but it was low from the roadway. He's like, hey, you're building this project right next door. Can we have your dirt? And we said, sure, you can have our dirt. And then the contractor only had to employ scrapers. He didn't have to haul it to the dump. So the cost of our project came down. We had a ready disposal site for the dirt. It was kind of a win-win for everybody. And then he got his property raised up. Subdivision development. We've had some of our property where they've needed to locate a sanitary sewer lift station in exchange for upsizing the storm drain. So we've done that. It's all about kind of building that partnership, figuring out where it is. Sponsorships and donations, Presbyterian Loveless with a walking trail, P&M, that's our local electric company with a shade structure. So you put all those things in, you put their name on it, and everybody's pretty good to go. Improving your chances. So I think this is really important. Identify your project priorities and revisit them annually. You need to be flexible about this and look at it because your priorities can change based on your funding source. And don't be bound by your priority list. Your top project, maybe, you know, it's just not ready. It's just not there yet for the funding sources, but maybe the next one down or two down is, or you get approached by somebody saying, hey, I'm working in this area, and you look down, you've got project number 12 on your list is right there. So, you know, don't be tied to that list and you say, oh, I got to do these other 11 first. And then don't be tied to your ideas too much. So you have an idea of what you want to do, but the funding agency may be, oh, well, if you did it this way, it would really work out better. Or your partners are like, hey, it'd be great if we could really do this with it. And as long as it gets you there, you know, you got to be flexible and work with folks and just kind of roll with it a little bit, because, you know, the top priority project at the end of the day is the one that can be successfully funded and completed. So, you know, it's important to look at that. Complete your planning documents, identify what improvements you need, take pictures. Do you have a drone? It's $200. Buy a drone, take pictures, doesn't have to have all the fancy stuff on it. Download them, put them in your document. Everybody loves drone pictures. They do really good. Identify your funding. It can be real basic, real simple. Doesn't have to be like down to the penny. You just got to get it close. And engineers aren't necessary for planning documents. If you've got somebody who knows how to write and do things, you can put that together and get that done. It's nice to use them, but if you don't have the funding for it, put it together yourself. Get the guy, the person in the office that knows how to write, has a technical writing background or has the ability to put that stuff together. Put them to work. You've got somebody that likes graphics and can work with it. Hey, get them to put that together, and then get them adopted. If you get it adopted, then you've got this, like, you know, official support. Oh, well, it's been adopted by our local council. They really want to see this project happen. And document materials can be recycled. Recycle, recycle, recycle. So this is a picture from our office when we went through and digitized a lot of our documents. but there's a lot of reports and materials in here that we have used over and over again because they're valid and they work. So now you're adding all this like bibliography into your application. Oh, and it relates to this document and it relates to this document, and it all looks really good. So reuse that existing documentation, your planning reports, design plans, news articles, development reports, cite and reference if it's not yours. Make your project more appealing. So again, your planning documents has references, it looks more professional. Increase your match above minimum if you have it. So you want 25%, I'll give you 26. We'll make it work. Partnerships, so those partnerships are great if you bring other people in. Letters of support, all that, it's really important to have those letters of support to show that other people in the community really want your project to succeed. And then of course, shovel ready, that was mentioned. I'm a little skeptical of shovel ready projects. They're kind of unicorns. They do exist, really. But the most common is your right-of-way. If you have your right-of-way secured, that's probably the biggest thing that you can do to be prepared for your project. And that's the biggest worry that most funding agencies have is, do you have the right to be on the property where you're going to build your project? So if you're going to do anything, get your right-of-way secured. Environmental planning is great, conceptual design, full design, all those. They get you down the list. That's the unicorn level where you've got everything done. It's like, it's all ready to fund. All we need is the funding. But that's good. And then remember the golden rule: don't bite the hand that feeds you. So with this funding process, it can be long, lengthy, it can be complex, it can be frustrating. But be courteous to your funding agency. They've got a job. Their job is to do the money, is to get it pushed out, is to do whatever else their job is. You've got your job, and everybody's trying to work together. So if you go into it grumbling about, oh, this agency and blah, 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 well, you're not going to present a very good appearance. So just understand that they're human too. We're all in this together, and work with them. Focus on the communication. What do they prefer? Do they like phone calls? Do they like emails? People are different. So figure out what works. And then you can ask solution-based questions. Did I fill this out right? Is this what you're looking for? Look for that. And provide data and material back to the agencies. If you complete a project, send them the pictures, send them the planning documents. Say, hey, look what we did with your money. It's all here. Here's some stuff that you can use now. So that's always really good. Keep your eyes open. So the one constant in life is change. There's new funding opportunities that pop up. There's changes to existing funds, like the Land and Water Conservation Fund expired in 2018. It was reauthorized this year. Funding agency priorities changed. So the FEMA PDM program became the BRIC program, and the criteria changed a little bit. Interest rates change. If it's up at 5-6%, no, not going to do it. But if it's at 0%, maybe it's workable. Agency personnel, those people change for good or bad. Maybe you've got somebody you work really well with and it's awesome, and then they retire. You're like, now I got to work with somebody new. Or maybe you're working with somebody and you've kind of got to at loggerheads with that person, and you're like, it makes it really tough. Well, if that changes, well, you need to go back. Don't abandon it. Kind of come in and look for projects adjacent to your own, because you never know when something's going to pop up. So you always got to keep your eyes open. A couple examples. I just saw this a couple weeks ago. I didn't even know that there was an international mountain bike association that provided grants. I had no idea they existed until I was reading the local paper. We have trail systems. Hey, mountain bikes can go on trail systems. So that's somebody we're going to reach out to and just see what's going on. But if I hadn't been looking and reading the paper, I wouldn't have seen it. The other one, adjacent projects. The Bureau of Reclamation was down here in the river. Theirs is kind of the yellow area. They were improving some fish habitat. And it happened to pass by right one of the outlets of one of our arroyos that we've been thinking of approving. Hey, let's partner, let's work together. And so now they're building part of our project for us. We're paying a portion of it, they're paying a portion, and so it's working out. So those are things you just got to kind of keep looking at. And then finally, finish strong, do the work, spend the money. Everybody wants the money spent. Money does not go backwards into the federal system. It just doesn't work well. It doesn't go that way. They want to push it out, get it built, and be done with it. The funding agencies, they need to establish their need for future funds for the next funding cycle. They need to document that projects are completed. Legislators need photo ops, hold a ribbon cutting, do a press release, give everybody a picture, make it a win for everybody, so that at the end of the day, everybody goes, that was great. We loved working with you. And so we're going to be more likely next time to work with you. So that was probably drinking from a fire hose. So my apologies if I went very fast, and I'll turn it over to Ray.
Outstanding, Chuck. You've given us some great resources for gaining resources and great ideas. Let's go with the first question specific to you, and then we'll handle a couple of questions with both you and Julie. Were you able to pull together a funding source team from your partners to tackle the funding process?
So for the funding source team, I used mostly internal staff here. So part of the benefit that I've had is I'm clocking on year 30 right now in kind of public service for that, and I've been here for 10 years, and I've been involved with funding agencies for some time. So it really wasn't as much as trying to identify outside folks as it was identifying, you know, the skills and abilities in-house, so to speak. And I think one of the keys is getting people comfortable with it. So when you start trying to assemble that funding team, you know, the first thing you want to do is say, okay, well, does the person who are our fiscal director, the person who runs the books, you know, they can handle a lot of those finance questions. It's just kind of in a different format. And so if you can get like an example of a completed project and say, okay, this is what the funding chart looked like, you can build that skill set internally. And the funding agencies will help you because they want to get that data reported correctly too. So you can turn in an example and they'll help train you.
And then I suppose the multiplying effect of everybody looking within internal staff, everyone's looking at the newspaper, they're looking at the next funding, they're looking at the next project that you just presented just a few slides ago, right? And those opportunities for engagement and leveraging, right, other resources. So here's a question. How do you manage the multiple funding sources with different timelines, application delays, and deadlines? Have you got a whiz-bang system on your computer there that you wake up in the morning, you come in the office, and boom, you know exactly where you're at with all of these various funding sources, different timelines, application delays, deadlines for each of the projects? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. What we do is we have basically a bi-weekly capital projects meeting. So we get our fiscal people in, we get the project managers in, myself, you know, people that are involved in the projects, and we just go kind of project by project. Where are we at on this one? What's going on? And it's just that it's a constant feedback loop of you know where a project is, and then keeping in that email communication, you know, on when forms need to be signed and turned in, you know, keeping all of those things on track. So it's not really, on the one hand, it's nothing really magical. It's basically kind of just setting up a discrete time every, you know, periodically, a week, every 2 weeks, whatever, and just go, hey, where are we at on this? And then you kind of go through the basic questions. Where's the funding at? Do we need to do any responses to anything? You know, are we waiting on something? And and a lot of it can be very repetitive. You know, you'll kind of say the same thing because there's been no movement from one meeting to the next, but that's okay.
Yeah, and then when there is, that you can concentrate on that. Had one request, Charles. Would you be able to provide the list of funding sources from the beginning of your presentation? And I think you and I talked about, you know, maybe I could share the PowerPoint in a PDF file to folks, and then they would have that. But do you have that list in a different format that you'd want to share with the folks?
Sure, that's easy enough to do.
All right,
put that together.
Send that to Dan and I, and we'll make sure it gets out to all the folks so we can cover that one fairly quickly. So let's ask Julie to join you because the next questions kind of deal with both of you. Hey, Julie, how about that one question I asked Chuck, and that was, do you got a whiz-bang system for monitoring all of those cool projects and things that are going on and timelines and applications? And oh my gosh, you know, it's got it just in case you have something.
Well, I have to say, I really love Chuck's slide that showed all of the different timelines and dates, because that is really one of the truisms of this, right? That you get started on a project only to realize you needed a state approval 2 months ago in order to apply for the grant that's due in 2 months in front of you. I'd say on our end, very similar to Chuck's response, we don't have a magic system that just keeps all of those dates, but we build quite a few Excel sheets trying to combine all those pieces, because once you start building in those multiple funding sources, it gets really complicated quick. But it's really about managing the schedule, right, and that good project management. And so we do a similar piece where we have the funding people and our implementation people meeting and connecting in and confirming those timelines and what needs to be ready by when.
Mm-hmm. All right. All right. So the next question I'm going to ask both of you, because it kind of came in right in between your talks. Have you integrated the Regional Conservation Partnership Program into the Public Law 566 program? So these are both Natural Resources Conservation Service programs, and you went way beyond that. But the question is specific to RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, integrated with PL 566.
Chuck, would you like to begin, or would you like me to
Sure.
start?
I'll start, and unfortunately, no, we haven't combined those two. For us as a flood control agency, our happy place with NRCS is really the PL 566 program, and that's where we primarily focused our efforts. So we haven't had a chance to kind of put those two sources together. We've done it in other areas with other funding sources, but on those two specifically, we have not.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. How about it, Julie?
We've worked with RCPP as well as PL 566 funds, and partially because those funds are also connected in a lot of ways. But it really comes down to the size of the project for us. So when it tends to be smaller projects and individual landowners, RCPP tends to be better funding. And one of the big pieces is you don't have to have NEPA and write a watershed plan for those funds, right? Because it's a smaller amount of capital. On the larger projects where we're listing at holistic system-wide modernization that will last many years and be around a $25 million project budget, that's when we start looking at the watershed plans in PL 566. And so both tools are really critical tools in our toolbox. It just depends on the size and the scale of the project, but many of our projects have worked using both RCPP funds and then PL 566, or in the reverse, we look at PL 566 to address the mainline irrigation system, and then work on a PL 560, RCPP application to support on-farm applications connected to those projects.
Almost like a feeder program, huh? You use the RCPP to catch a little bit of it and get it started, get your partnerships rolling, and then move it to Public Law 566. I imagine the data sets and whatnot are, complementary. Once you've developed them for a smaller project, you blow them up bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the district and what makes sense in that irrigation community and where the landowners are and what they're looking to achieve. But they're both incredible programs and really great tools for accelerating on the ground projects.
Mm-hmm. And Ray, I think you hit a key point there, is that data, the materials you collect, the words you use, all of those you can leverage. You put them in the first document, and then you put them in the second document, and maybe you tweak it a little bit, but you're really not reinventing the entire wheel. You're just kind of changing it up a little bit. And the same thing with funding and managing the multiple funding sources. At the end of the day, it's spreadsheet work. I mean, it's addition and subtraction. And so I think a lot of people get really kind of freaked out by that, but you just have to kind of like calm down, put it all together, and just kind of march it through, because it's the same thing they're doing with everything, from your personal checkbook all the way up. You're using the same logic paths, you're using the same, math to get there.
It's really those simple steps, right? It's repeating many simple steps and really charting out the most basic step possible and making sure you build out that plan.
Chuck, you touched on something that must be of interest to all of the participants, and that is, and actually both of you talked about success, lends itself to more success, and success and shared credit, right, to your partnerships. Those that have brought time, money, and energy, resources to the effort. Talk about it, both of you. Let's start with you, Chuck. Talk about, how that success, in your 30 some years has really built more success, and the importance of shared gain and shared public outreach.
Okay, I'll give a couple examples. First is just the funding agencies themselves. Mm-hmm. I think if you've had a successful project and you've worked well with an agency with those staff, then the next time you put in an application, you're kind of a known quantity. They know who you are. You've exchanged just kind of casual information in the process of managing the project. Hey, how are your kids doing? What's going on? You know, what are your interests? You know, you go out mountain biking or you do whatever. So you've kind of developed a personable relationship. So that lends itself to that next step. So that's one way where that's success. And so if you've been successful and they're like, okay, we worked with this entity and they weren't a complete, you know, pain in the tuchus, and we got a project built. Okay, so the next time they come in, that's good. You know, for the review times and everything else, you start building that reputation of, okay, they know what they're doing. And so you don't have that tension built up in the relationship. Another example is with the local legislators. As I mentioned, it's important to have that win at the end, to be able to go out and have that photo op, to do that ribbon cutting, to be able to put it out there. But it lends itself in other ways too. So once you've had that success, I mean, I've been approached by several of our legislators who have said, hey, I've got some extra money, right? And I know that you will complete a project. What can you do with it? And I'm just like, whoa, you know, that is awesome. If you get to that point where they're like, hey, who do we know that's going to get something done, that's you know, that's going to get me a success story, you can really start gaining some of that benefit, because now they're coming to you for things to get that done. So it can really roll in your favor if you, start building that success.
I'm sure the opposite is true too, but you have both developed the trust, the relationship. Isn't it great if a legislature calls you and says, hey, you got a project in mind? Because we got a few dollars. Julie, to this point, success, building on success, the outreach, huh?
You know, I wanted to build off what Chuck said, and in particular, when he was presenting, he talked about rejected applications. And when I was speaking, I was talking about ways that we meet with people and we hear them. Sometimes those rejected applications give you the best information for setting up going forward. We first started 15 years ago. We applied for funding from one of our favorite agricultural agencies, and we got rejected. And we called them after, which is really important. Call and find out why you did or didn't get funding. You always want that information. And we called them afterwards and they said, we didn't know what a fish screen was.
Oh.
And we thought, wait, you're an ag organization, but we forget that the people were in DC, Washington, DC, where they don't have irrigated agriculture. And so the point of that being is, don't assume everyone knows what you know, and it's very simple. And from that point on, we've always started communicating with farmers need water to grow crops, to get this water, because those basics are sometimes the foundation for building that relationship in space. And we reapplied again the next year. We explained what a fish screen was, and we got funded. And I also agree with Chuck that success builds upon success, and the idea of belief. And we saw that effect happening here in Oregon when the first district started getting PL 566, and we saw holistic modernization of their districts and those benefits. Everyone else started to believe, and they got excited, and they started putting their energy toward it, because it's hard to work on these long timelines and visions if you feel like it's not going to go anywhere. And so I absolutely agree that belief helps fuel more great work happening. And so conversations like this, I believe, are just so important to helping facilitate work that's really so essential and is the backbone to the health of our country. And it's really incredible work.
I sure did hear some common themes, and I'm going to turn it right back over to Dan and Lisa for their closing comments. But I heard that if you had your goals and common goals for what it is the project would accomplish would be very important, and have those very clear, that you would really work together, either singly or as partners, on the outcomes and payoffs, the benefits that are going to be achieved by working together. You have noted that leadership is important, and the ability to be able to move the group toward those common goals in a timely manner. And it's not only the leadership at the front of the room, but it's the leadership in accounting and keeping track of things and working on things and getting things done when you can. The diversity that you folks presented, I mean, the diversity when it came to funding sources, and the diversity in being able to get a lot of people involved and involving people from a diverse background and in your partnership was important. The commitment, my sense is, while you didn't really drive on this, the commitment by the people that you have to accomplish those goals for a project is extremely important. And we've just talked about a very fruitful discussion in communication. How do we have an effective effective communication system among those alliance partners and those partners, and then to keep everyone abreast of what's going on and how it's going and what's needing to be done. And the sensitivity to turf concerns melts away when you ask the question, what is it looks like when it's working well or the project is completed? But the openness about partnership concerns and issues is important too. And then Chuck gave us a wonderful example of how that turf just melted down. You know, as someone that was more willing to do public outreach, but really didn't want to do the engineering and wouldn't be supplying the engineering because engineering could be done by others. It's my pleasure to introduce our closing comments from Dan Siebert. And Lisa, if you've got a few closing comments too, we'll invite you. Dan?
Well, I'd just like to thank both of our presenters. Two tremendous presentations, excellent job, and right on the money. I think we heard some solutions to some common problems that folks who like to get things done face, and really appreciate you all taking time. I hope that you all are willing maybe to be available via email or phone for folks that might feel like they need to chat one-on-one with you.
Certainly.
Or I see two head nods. That's good.
Yeah.
But I appreciate everybody hanging with us today, and I hope you found this worthwhile. I know I did.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. Lisa, any closing comments? No, Lisa might not have joined us. Folks, thanks so much for joining us. Again, just to make note that recording will be available and we'll be putting that up on the website that's up on the screen there. The National Watershed Coalition website. We'll also be sending you a note when that recording is available. We'll also send out the slide deck in a PDF file, and that will also give you some great information. And again, I'll add my thanks to the presenters today. Thanks so much. And then that's the conclusion of our webinar today. Thank you, folks.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Ray.
You bet. Bye now.